All right, so NTFS permissions, NTFS meaning that we are using this format, this file system format, NTFS, new technology file systems. We formatted the drive that way. So now we can use these permissions. If we didn't format the drive that way, then we can't use these permissions. This is particular to the file system you installed. And so what you end up with is being able to set permissions on a folder and a file. And that complicates things. So they want to talk about cumulative and inherited permissions. If you ever go into server work, a lot of stuff happens this way because you may have given a certain group permissions to a file, which is bad. You usually never give permissions to a file. You only do it to folders because it gets so complicated. But you gave certain ones permissions to files. You disallowed those permissions on the folder, and being able to find out what the heck and who's got the permissions is important. And that's what that is referring to. And then the file attributes are actually a bit that can be set, like the archive bit. So we'll look at that. Right, so here's the permissions. You've got read. I can read it, but I can't write to it. And that is applied to folders or files, as we'll see in a minute. The main thing you need to understand is I can read the file. I can read what's in the folder, but I cannot do anything else. Write means that I can actually read and write. So the only reason to be able to, how should I say it? You're not going to just have write permissions. You should have read and write permissions together, because now you can actually make changes to that folder or changes to that file. Microsoft also includes list folder contents, meaning that I can list what's in there, but I can't read anything that's in there, and I can't write. I just get to see a list of what's there. It's kind of an interesting concept that they do, but we mainly deal with Windows, and so this is important to understand they have that ability. And then you have read and execute. That means that if there's an executable in the folder, I can actually execute it. I can actually make it run. Read and run would be another term for that. So I can not only just look at that, but I can also double click it if it's executable and it'll run. And then I can modify the folder permissions itself. So I can give the folder these permissions. And then full control, obviously, that means I can do everything. I can even take ownership. Now, that's a concept that we don't get into too much in this class, but what it means is we need a way to track who did what electronically, especially if there's some kind of legal issue. And so if I can take ownership of a folder, then that will be tracked. If James McBride goes in and says, take ownership, in other words, I'm the owner of this folder now, which owners of folders have full control, then the system will read that and remember it. So that later on, if it's needed, they can say, oh, James McBride took control of that. That's what that's for, take ownership. So here's your file permissions. Read the file, write the file. You can see that's kind of the same. Read and execute the file, and then modify those, and then full control. So it's pretty much the same thing as folders, except you can do it on a file-based situation. Again, it's not recommended that you do that because you have hundreds and thousands of files. Oh, I can't remember if I gave them that permission or that. So usually they organize the files according to folders, and then they give the folders the permissions and they don't mess with the files. But it's the same, you got the same permissions. Right, and then when you overall NTFS permissions, okay, now you start to look at who's got what, who can do what here. And that begins to deal with our cumulative and inherited permissions, that if you've got a folder and a subfolder and a subfolder and a subfolder, the standard is this folder's permissions flow down to the other folders. But sometimes you don't want that to happen. So the James McBride has access to this folder, but then he doesn't have access to the next one. And I'm actually going to say he doesn't have access to that. Okay, well then what's my cumulative permissions then? What is that? Because the other of this one's got access and it flows down is inherited. inheritance permissions. Thankfully, at this level, you don't have to deal much with that. We do this kind of stuff in the server class. We talk about it in networking and also in 113. Now, file attributes are different. File attributes, we're going to just jump to what they are here. If you right-click on a file, on the main screen, you've got your attributes down at the bottom, and you can actually see some of it, like is it archivable, or is it hidden, or is it a system? These are just bits on the file that have basically been around since the 90s, since the 70s and 80s, depending on the OS that you were running in. So these are DOS compatible, I guess is what I should say. Archive is another word for backup. And that bit gets set whenever the file's been altered. So if you had a notebook, a notepad file, and it hadn't been altered since its creation, then the archive bit's not set. As soon as you go in and you type something in there and hit save, now the archive bit is set. And that tells any backup software that you're using, hey, that needs to be backed up. That's what the archive bit says. Hidden means that it's just not going to show up. You won't see it in a list unless you go to the preferences and say, show me hidden files, and then you can see it. So way back a long time ago, this was the way you kept things secure. You could hide a folder, you could hide the files in it. And in DOS, it was really hard to find that stuff. Now you just turn that checkbox on or off saying, show me the hidden stuff, and it shows it to you. It is kind of nice though to still have it, and the system will use it because there's some files they do not want you messing with, and they'll hide the folder. So you can go and find it and get into the folder if you need to, but they really don't want you just traipsing in there and doing whatever. System indicates that's a critical system file, and it's hidden. And then read only. Anything you copy to a CD, right? It sets the flag as this is a read-only file. And you can go and set the little check mark on that. So you can grab that notepad that just got backed up because the archive bit was set, and you can go in there and check mark that and say it's read-only. That means the next time you click on the file, it will come up and say, hey, this is a read-only file. You type some new stuff in there and hit save, and it says, this is a read-only file. You'll have to save it to a different file. So back in the day, that was the way to make sure that nobody messed up your stuff. And you could still do that today. You could say, man, I don't want this file to change. I'll set that bit to read only, or that attribute to read only. That way, if anybody ever opens it and accidentally tries to delete something, it won't delete anything because it'll come up and say, you have to save this under a different name. Then there's some extra stuff that comes with NTFS. This is actually all comes with DOS stuff. NTFS gives you the ability to compress a folder or a file on the fly. You just put a check mark on it and it goes boop and compresses it. That was a big deal back in the day when we had limited hard drive space. Now, not so much. We don't really worry about that too much, but it can be done. Encrypted. So yeah, you can go in and say this file's encrypted. You just turn on the check mark. Now remember that that's linked to your user ID. So if somebody gets in with your user ID, they can see what's in that file. That's the thing. Also remember that if you're doing this kind of stuff, if you copy that to another system, like I shouldn't say another system, but I do mean another system, another file system. So you plug in your USB and it's not NTFS, and you copy that over, then it's going to unencrypt it and put an unencrypted file on that, because it's assuming that's what you want to do. But you forgot it was encrypted, and now you're copying it to exFAT, and so it'll take the encryption off and put it on there. If you're copying it to an NTFS volume, then it'll stay encrypted. And then if you take that to someplace else and plug it in, no, it's not smart enough to go, oh, please use your user ID and password to identify yourself. No, that's on your other system. That's where you created the encrypted file. If you put it on there and take it to someplace else, it'll just say this is encrypted, you can't open it. So you have to be aware of that. And then not context indexed, meaning don't include this in, you may remember, but you probably don't. And back in Windows XP, whew, oh, it was such a pain. You wanted to search for something, and so you'd search for a document or thing. It started taking forever. It would take forever. And then usually you didn't find what you wanted. Well, something that Apple was doing long before was they would go through and index the hard drive while you weren't looking. So basically the thing's chunking away while you're not doing stuff, and it's looking through the entire hard drive, and it's creating basically an index in a file that's easy to read. And then it updates that when things change. So Microsoft started doing that, thankfully, when we got to Windows Vista and Windows 7. So now if you type in James McBride, it goes boom, 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 here's what we're looking for. And really all it's doing is searching the index file, because that's a lot faster than searching the entire hard drive to find it. So you can actually in Windows say, don't index this. In other words, it won't pull up on somebody's search. They'll have to do the old-fashioned search, which will take a long time. They also do that on volumes because indexing does take processing power, and it also takes storage space, and you may not want, your 12 terabyte hard drive that you plug in every so often to be indexed. So that's the other thing with that. All right, well, that is it on these permissions. You get a chance to go in there and do that, which is cool.